The New Orleans Saints will miss the NFL postseason for the third straight year. So what changes need to be made to make sure that doesn't happen again in 2024? We get all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, your credentialed media member covering the New Orleans Saints as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints. And on today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at what changes need to happen as the New Orleans Saints embark upon the offseason. The season is officially over for New Orleans after they didn't get the help that they needed in the NFC playoff race. And so because of that, we're going to take a look at some of the changes to be considered on defense, highlighting specifically the defensive line in this episode. Take a look at some of the changes to consider on offense as well. But for first, the biggest change, then the top priority that should be on the way, which is change and upgrade at offensive coordinator. And as always, a big thank you for being an everydayer here on the show and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets by simply placing any $5 bet. Win or lose, it's $150 on the way to you. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. So, the New Orleans Saints missed the playoffs, and if they want to make sure that they don't do it for a fourth season in a row going into 2024, upgrading their offensive system is an absolute must, and it starts with offensive coordinator. The New Orleans Saints need to get into today's era of the NFL, just plain and simple. Doesn't mean that they have to all of a sudden, turn the tide and change everything in terms of what they want to do at quarterback. Derek Carr still will be the quarterback in 2024. That's the expectation. Nothing is going to point to anything else when it comes to that. And so with that, you don't necessarily have to change a ton of stuff in terms of, how you build your offense and going out and grabbing a new quarterback and getting a mobile passer and all that other stuff. But you definitely have to be able to take advantage of what Derek Carr has to offer. And I do not feel, up until maybe the last couple of games this season, that the New Orleans Saints did that adequately throughout the year. Now, of course, Derek Carr was also dealing with injury and all those other things. But even outside of Derek Carr and his ability as a quarterback, which has its pluses, has its minuses, of course, the New Orleans Saints offensive system just never really had an identity. It still doesn't. I get the idea that they want to be this explosive offense, and they certainly looked like it against the Atlanta Falcons as they put 48 points up on the board. But to do that in Week 18, that's not your identity. That's just what you did in Week 18, right? Your identity is what you do from Weeks 1 through Week 18. And so the identity for me, for the New Orleans Saints on the offensive side of the football, is nothing more than inconsistency. It's nothing more than mediocrity. And then you got to see a little bit of that above average play toward the end of the season, which is great and kind of what balanced it out for me, because early on, the struggles were evident when it came to the New Orleans Saints offense. So some of that came down to, Derek Carr getting more comfortable with his weapons, the Saints finally sort of figuring out who their weapons were, fewer personnel group changes, all these other things. But you had to make changes in spite of the issues that your offensive system presented. So you were tweaking and fudging things around all throughout the season instead of just having an identity, having a system that supported your quarterback, that supported your playmakers and all those other things. So if I'm Mickey Loomis, Dennis Allen, and the New Orleans Saints, I'm looking at my roster because look, not a lot's going to change, right? Saints don't have a lot of players that are going to be on their way out. Jameis Winston, Michael Thomas, and then a couple of other guys on offense. Zach Bond. We'll see what happens with Marshawn Lattimore and others over on the defensive side. But on the offensive side, you're not going to see a ton of turnover when it comes to this New Orleans Saints team. Alvin Kamara should still be on this team next year. Jamal Williams probably still on the team next year. Kendre Miller on his rookie deal. Chris Olave, rookie deal. Rashid Shaheed, new deal. Rookie deal. You look at sort of where all these guys are. A.T. Perry, Juwan Johnson's on a new deal. Foster Moreau's on the second year of his longer deal. The offensive line needs its upgrades, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So I think that's probably where you're going to see the most turnover is over in the offensive line. But when you think about the skill position players, Juwan Johnson, A.T. Perry, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Alvin Kamara, Kendre Miller, Jamal Williams, that's pretty much what you've got. Foster Moreau, we'll see what happens with Jimmy. That's the big thing for me right now. And so if you look at, you know what your team is, you know what you have. How did you not maximize it this year? How do you maximize it next year? I think that's got to be what the evaluation process is. Where did your system come up short in supporting your players in your roster? And how do you upgrade that system? And if you're worried about execution and you're worried about buy-in from those players, what is the system that you go and get to make them buy in? Because if you're concerned about buy-in, if you're concerned about execution, then you can't use the same system because they're not going to execute. They're not going to buy in if you just say, okay, well, we're using the exact same system all over again, and it's the same play caller, it's the same offensive coordinator, all these other things. You have to make a change here. Nothing is going to work unless you make a change here. And so I think that that's what has to be priority number one for the New Orleans Saints. The next thing that I look at when it comes to upgrading that offensive system is how do you improve your offensive line, right? So we're going to talk about some offensive line changes here in a little bit when we go through some of the changes to consider on offense. But I do think that potentially you could see a change at the coaching staff at offensive line as well. Doug Marrone, you didn't get the production that you wanted from your offensive line. You didn't get the play that you wanted from your offensive line. You went out and spent a first-round pick last year on a very good offensive lineman, though developmental, and then effectively just gave up on him 4 or 5 games into the season this year in Trevor Penning. Is that really you didn't have anything that guy could do? You didn't have any way to get that guy ready? You didn't have any way to make him better? I mean, we saw it with Alontae Taylor, right? Alontae Taylor got benched and then was back out there the next week, gets his first interception, gets benched, goes back out there in another game, in the same game as he gets benched a second time, gets an interception. Like, you can see the value of teaching the lesson with the benching, but then giving the player the opportunity to make up for it, opportunity to navigate the adversity. Trevor Penning hasn't been given anything close to that opportunity. What's going on there? So you have to look at your offensive line coaching right now, because clearly, if your offensive line coaching isn't able to develop a first-round talent, you probably need some changes there, right? So I think offensive coordinator, offensive line coach, those are places where I could absolutely see the Saints making some changes. They're not going to happen this week. They're more than likely, the Saints are going to treat this just like they treated last year. They're going to go away, and they're going to come back, they're going to evaluate everything, and then they'll make their staff changes. So it might be a month before we hear anything about staff changes. Hopefully it happens before the Senior Bowl. That way you've got your actual new offensive coordinator there working with some of these players, getting to know some of these players, watching throughout practices, all these other things. But we don't know. We don't know if that's going to be the case. And the Saints aren't going to fall behind on the offensive coordinator search because offensive coordinator is not going to move that quickly, right? Teams are still going to be going through their head coaching, hiring cycles, all these other things. You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. You don't have to rush this decision. So it makes sense why the New Orleans Saints would definitely take their time when it comes to this, though the sooner the better, just because it does at least maximize your pool in some way. And the Saints, some guys that I like, Clint Kubiak from over with the San Francisco 49ers, formerly of the Minnesota Vikings, Zach Robinson of the Los Angeles Rams. These are guys that are kind of in the passing game coordinator / quarterback coach kind of, trajectory and all. And Ronald Curry, that's already here in New Orleans. He's another one that's quarterback coach, passing game coordinator. Like, that's in his blood and all. And so I like that. The Saints have the chance to do the funniest thing in the entire world and wait to see if Arthur Smith gets fired and then potentially hire him as their, or at least interview him as their offensive coordinator. They should not hire him as their offensive coordinator because there again is an offense where, it's just going to want to overly commit to the run game in that case and not go to the playmakers when you need to go to the playmakers. So they shouldn't hire Arthur Smith, but they could do the funniest thing ever and interview him. So we'll see what happens with all that. But I do think that the Saints will have good candidates at OC, but I don't think they're going to be in a rush to make that decision. I think that they'll do it in a calculatory and non-reactive way, just like they did their staff changes last year. All right, coming up next, let's take a look at some of the upgrades that can happen over on the offensive side. We're going to start off with the trenches, the offensive line. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you and all those small businesses out there that are all asking themselves the same question. What's the one thing that I can do to take my business to the next level in 2024? LinkedIn Jobs knows that, look, you've got all that success in the world that depends on the folks that you surround yourself with. That's why LinkedIn does everything that it can to make sure that you get the opportunity to get access to the right professionals for your team faster and for free. Don't think of LinkedIn as just some other job board, okay? LinkedIn is going to give you a vast network of over 1 billion, Billion professionals, which makes it the best place to post your job. Hiring is super easy when you have that pool of candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get qualified candidates within 24 hours of posting their jobs, and you can do the same. Post your job today for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. New Orleans Saints need to make a change at offensive coordinator, but they also have some changes in offensive personnel that could make some sense for them, including some changes that, well, they might not have a choice in the matter anyway. So we've got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode. Appreciate all you everydayers making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Make sure you go and check out that Locked On Sports Today 24/7 feed, the first of its kind when it comes to a sports channel over on YouTube. So go and check them out today. Locked On Sports Today. Get subscribed now. All right, so as we take a look at the potential changes that the New Orleans Saints should be considering on offense, I want to start with the offensive line. The New Orleans Saints gave up, it's going to be 31 sacks by the time that it's all said and done. That kind of trip up by Calais Campbell as Taysom Hill was scrambling to the right sideline, that was considered a sack in this game, or in their game against the Atlanta Falcons. So I think we're looking at 31 sacks given up by the New Orleans Saints, 31-32. And majority of them were on third downs. This was a big thing for New Orleans. At one point, they had given up 30 sacks. 19 of them were on third downs. That included the third down sack of Derek Carr during this Atlanta Falcons game. The Saints desperately need an improved offensive line. You have to be able to have time for your quarterback to be able to dole things out, especially when you are a little bit more of a traditional drop back team. Even if you're adding in things like moving the pocket and utilizing play action, both things that should be happening more in 2024 than they did in 2023, should have been happening more in 2023 than they did, but took a long time for them to figure out that that's where they wanted to go with it. This is why they need a new offensive coordinator. You can see why the New Orleans Saints struggled so much early. And look, they're going to have to make changes here one way or another. Do they keep James Hurst? Do they keep Andres Pete? Or does one or both of those guys walk this offseason? If that's the case, no matter what, you're making a change. Is Trevor Penning really going to be your starting left tackle moving forward? Or did you give up on him entirely, as it looked like the Saints might have done over the course of the season? Now, I'm sure that they didn't give up on him entirely, but hard not to get that idea when they were down to their 8th, 9th offensive lineman, and they didn't even put Trevor Penning in as the jumbo guy. I mean, pretty loud indictment the more and more that you see that. And if you're not going to do that, then if you're not going to develop the guy, then what are you wasting time with here? So for me, I think the Saints need to really look at their offensive line and figure out what to do there. They don't know what's going to happen with the future of Ryan Ramczyk, right? So that might be a third offensive lineman that they lose. The only two guys that are solidly in place going into next year are Cesar Ruiz and Eric McCoy. And that's it. And both Cesar Ruiz and Eric McCoy were very vocal about you're wanting to change the play to get Jamal Williams that touchdown at the end of the season. How does that sit with Dennis Allen and the New Orleans Saints organization? Heck, how does the players making that decision impact the way that the Saints look at Dennis Allen? That's another question too. But thinking about what's more likely, which would be that the Saints will make player personnel changes and offensive coordinator changes as opposed to a head coach change, examining the offensive line is mighty important for them, because you're going to need to buy time for your quarterback. And especially if they want to continue to be this explosive offense, then they're going to need to allow time for route concepts downfield to uncover, to work, to happen. If they're going to upgrade their offensive system, today's NFL means you need more time. And, you can do some things with like quick passes, intermediate area, stuff like that. But a lot of stuff in today's NFL offenses takes time. So you need the offensive line to get it done. Think about some of the teams that are running top flight modern day offenses. San Francisco, Miami, Philadelphia is a great example outside of the fact that they've been imploding over the course of the past like 4 weeks. Houston, solid offensive line play. Not always the best in the NFL, but look at the Miami Dolphins pre and post Austin Jackson's injury. You can see that there was a little bit of a hiccup, a little bit of a bump in the road when they lost the guy that protected the blind side of a Tua Tagovailoa. You need time in today's NFL offenses. And so in addition to looking at the coaching staff when it comes to the offensive line, I do think that there's value in looking at what you can do with your offensive line and getting some more talent there, building out some more depth, aiming for guys that can stay healthy, and probably aiming for speed too. Like that's another thing that you kind of need in today's NFL. And you don't even have to go that far back in New Orleans to see that. I mean, you think about when Teron Armstead was still at left tackle, before they added Ryan Ramczyk at right tackle, or really maybe even after they added Ryan Ramczyk at right tackle. It was one of the fastest offensive lines in the NFL if you average out everybody's 40 time. And what did that do? That made you explosive in the zone run game, right? Plus you had the protection up front that you needed as one of the better offensive lines in the NFL, all that. So adding some speed to that position or to those positions shouldn't be lost either. The big thing is the Saints might be having a new left tackle and a new right tackle line up in front of Derek Carr in 2024. And if that's going to be the case, you can't wait until week 14 to find a way to gel. That can't happen again like it happened here in 2023. You're going to get your quarterback obliterated by week 5 in that case. And so Derek Carr was already dealing with way more injuries in New Orleans in 2023 than he has dealt with over the course of his entire career. Keep him protected in 2024. Upgrading the offensive line is going to do that, but getting all these guys on the same page as their quarterback going to be just as important. The other thing that I look at you can upgrade or that's going to change over on the offensive side is going to be what happens with Michael Thomas. And this is one where the Saints might not even have a choice. Like Michael Thomas's contract is effectively over after this season. And look, since they redid his contract at the end of last year, it seemed that all signs were pointing to the idea that Michael Thomas would not be a New Orleans Saint in 2024 after this season, unless he racked up a bunch of incentives and stuff like that, which always felt unlikely anyway. This year, he finished the season adding 0 incentives to his contract. So now you have a receiving core that's led off by your top 3 guys in Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and A.T. Perry. From what we've seen over the course of the past 5 weeks, particularly over the course of, well, really, I mean, you look at that Atlanta Falcons game at the end of the season, you could see the positive outlook there, right? The future outlook and what promise could be there, right? I don't want to oversell anything. We don't know what it's going to look like in 2024, but based upon what you saw at the end of 2023, you could see the nature of positivity that could be there. So that's another place where I think you're going to see changes for New Orleans. But I do think that adding talent there and, again, getting younger at that position, just like you can also potentially get younger on the offensive line. You can get younger at running back. You can get younger at wide receiver. I think there's value in all of that. Lastly, tight end. Do you bring Jimmy Graham back? What goes on with Taysom Hill? There's still enough stuff kind of happening around that position that it's going to be very interesting to see where they go with all of it. I think Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau are a really good tandem. But I'll be curious to see if they add more talent to that room in place of a guy like Jimmy Graham. And I'm very interested to see what happens with Taysom Hill this offseason. How much of a culture change are the New Orleans Saints looking for this offseason? And how much of Sean Payton's folks are they trying to move on from? And what does that potentially mean for Taysom Hill, who was spectacular for them again this year? Great for them against Atlanta at the end of the season, all that. But that's another one that I'm looking at and going, I wouldn't overlook the possibility of a surprise move around Taysom Hill. Not that I feel like Taysom Hill deserves it. I think Taysom Hill should be a New Orleans Saint until he's done. But how do the New Orleans Saints manage their roster over the course of the offseason and what is there to expect. We don't know. We don't know just yet. All right, coming up next, let's wrap up by looking at upgrades on the defensive line and how the New Orleans Saints can get that done. Because I'm not just talking about getting better players. I'm talking about rethinking the entire prototype. Got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook and the place where you can make every moment more. The New Orleans Saints, they don't have a spread coming up, but they definitely covered the spread against the Atlanta Falcons considerably so. So maybe you got in on that and won a little bit of cash. If you haven't, and if you haven't tried FanDuel before, now is absolutely the time to do it. Because right now, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed by simply placing any $5 bet. That's it. $150 in bonus bets, win or lose, guaranteed just by placing a $5 bet. The app is super easy, secure, super safe to use, all that. And there's so many different ways to bet. There's live, same game parlays, live betting, always so much fun. You can find new bets in the Explore tab. You can make even more parlays over at the Parlay Hub, where you can find the best and most popular parlays that are already out there. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a look at the defensive side of the football, particularly the defensive line, which I think is the area that needs the most attention over the course of the offseason. Let's break it all down. Don't forget to come back for tomorrow's episode as well on Tuesday. We'll go through what we liked, what we didn't like from this game, and we'll also take a look, of course, at more of the big questions going in. We'll have some locker room attendance. We'll have Dennis Allen on Monday, later on today as well. So after that, I'll have some more good stuff for you on Tuesday, breaking it all down. All right, so Here's why I say the defensive line needs a lot of attention over the course of the offseason. It's not just the pass rush side of it, right? Like the Saints' pass rush has been inconsistent, was inconsistent all season. They really found something when they got to Zach Bond. But we've seen for a second year in a row a dip in the run game as well, right? The inability to stop the run, all that. They did a good job at different points throughout the end of the season. 14 yards to Saquon Barkley. They didn't even give up 100 rushing yards to the Atlanta Falcons in this game after giving up 200 in each of the last 3 games that they played. So there were some positives there toward the end of the season, but it was clear that this defensive line needed a little bit of help. And then the other thing was the mobile quarterback problem, right? So here's where I think the Saints can make the most immediate impact over on their defensive line. And it's by paying attention to what they learned with Zach Bond. It's unfortunate that it took until 4 years into Zach Bond's 4-year rookie deal, basically, to be used as a pass rusher. And because of that, I could understand if Zach Bond hit the free agency market as his contract expires this offseason and says, you know what, no, I'm going somewhere else. Y'all didn't use me the way that I feel that I should have been used, so I'm going to go somewhere that will. He would 100% be within his own right to do that. And I think that there are teams that would love his fit. I've always said the Philadelphia Eagles defense, for instance, would be a perfect fit for Zach Bond. So there's a good chance that Zach finds his way out of New Orleans and goes somewhere that utilizes him as a pass rusher in a scheme that is supportive of his prototype. If that happens, the Saints should not ignore what they've learned by utilizing Zach Bond finally properly, right? So either find a way to keep Zach Bond in the building so that you can continue to utilize him as a pass rusher, or draft/sign a young, speedy, athletic pass rusher and start to change away from the prototype of the 6'6", 280+ pound run stopper. I think that's got to be a big thing for the Saints here. Part of the reason why they've struggled against the run game so much over the course of the past 2 seasons is because of the mobile quarterbacks and because their defensive line hasn't been built to stop those mobile quarterbacks. They need the athleticism, they need the speed. Zach Bond has given them that, and we've outlined that several times in which, he's been able to close on a quarterback that was scrambling towards the outside, forcing that quarterback to throw the ball away, him being able to get 2 quarterbacks and get sacks, all these other pieces. It's all there. And so I think that if I'm the New Orleans Saints and I'm going into 2024 and I'm saying, okay, what are some of the things that we need to improve over on the defensive line? I'm looking at making sure that I am continuously looking at ways to introduce more speed, more athleticism to this defensive line. That doesn't mean you got to move on from anybody, right? Like Isaiah Foskey, Peyton Turner, Carl Granderson, and Cam Jordan, like all those guys can very well be in your plans for next year, but go out and find that next speedy, athletic pass rusher to go outside to complement the guys on the inside like Brian Brzee, Tana Passanio, Colin Saunders, and then, of course, Nathan Shepard. And it's really just about making sure that you're maintaining that one element, that one ingredient for your defensive line so you continue to have that skill set on the line to help you in the run game when a running back with good speed gets to the outside, in the run game against the quarterback when that quarterback breaks contain, in the pass rush by simply having somebody that can get to the quarterback quickly using speed as opposed to second, third efforts, 5-6 seconds into the play clock. What about getting to a quarterback within 3 seconds? What about getting to a quarterback off the line? Get somebody that can win immediately and then utilize the speed when that happens to immediately impact the quarterback from the edge, all those things. So that's got to be, for me, a big part of what you're looking at in terms of developing further this defensive line. And that will have its benefits in the run game, in the pass rush, in limiting the mobile quarterbacks, and all of those things, which in turn benefits your quarterback, right? Because you can get off the field in 3 downs and the offense goes out there, catches that opposing defense on a short breath, and then maybe capitalizes on something. Doing that to opposing offenses, opposing defenses would be absolutely critical for the success of the New Orleans Saints, who do not play an easy schedule in 2024. They've got teams like you've got playoff teams like the Browns. They've got the old Sean Payton and the Broncos are coming to town and all that. They got to travel to Dallas. Like there's all these things that they kind of have to deal with all throughout the season this year. Kansas City, like, they got a tough schedule, a much tougher schedule than the schedule that they had in 2023, right? I mean, you looked at the Saints and they spent all their time and they went and got the right coaching guys, the guys that on the coaching staff that Dennis Allen wanted. They had an easy schedule, the easiest division. Like we always said, there were no excuses for this team, and they still came up short. And you can't come up short in 2024. Otherwise, everybody's head's going to roll in that case. And then they are going to enter an actual rebuild at that point. We won't see a rebuild over the course of this offseason. They can't do it. But if they screw this up, go into next season and they end up 7-10, 6-11, something like that. Oh yeah. Get ready for a long couple of years in that case. But that's okay. We're not worried about that right now. We're worried about how the New Orleans Saints can get better going into 2024. And these are the things that I'm thinking about. Defensive line, improvements on the offensive line, as well as take a look at maybe adding some more speed to the offensive line, getting younger, and then, of course, rebuilding your offensive system, getting it into today's NFL, and letting Derek Carr be at the helm of that and see how it all works. Those are things that I'm looking at. All right, coming up tomorrow, we're going to give you more on or from Dennis Allen's press conference, end-of-year press conference, as well as some tidbits from the locker room, all that kind of stuff. We'll discuss a little bit more about the potential rift that's there when it comes to the coaching staff and the players going out there and changing out of the victory formation to get Jamal Williams a touchdown. Is it as big a deal as some people are making it, or is it not that big of a deal at all? We're going to highlight all that in tomorrow's episode. Appreciate you, as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Learn how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.